servants. She goes to the servants and she's like, just do whatever he tells you to do. So let's keep reading. Verse 6, standing nearby were 6 stone water jars. Water jars. These were used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. So Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. When the jars had been filled, he said, now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. So the servants followed his instructions. When the master of ceremonies tested the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants knew, he called the bridegroom over. A host always serves the best wine first, he said. Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine. But you have kept the best until now. This miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I want to backtrack a little bit. Go back to verse 7 and 8. Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. When the jars had been filled, he said, now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. So the servants followed his instructions. I grew up in church. I went to Sunday school, and I've heard this story told a lot of different ways. I've seen the videos, the children's videos. I've heard the stories about it. But you know, most of the time it's focused on Mary's faith. It's focused on the faith of Mary and how Mary believed that Jesus would do something miraculous. But I'm here to ask you, like, really, is it such a surprise that Mary would believe? I mean, Mary wasn't just present. She wasn't just a witness to the miraculous conception and birth of Jesus Christ. She was a part of it. She lived it the whole 9 months. And then for the kicker, she had the delivery. It wasn't a surprise to her that Jesus could do miracles. The Bible doesn't tell us every single thing that happened in Jesus' life, but being the mother of the Son of God, I'm sure that she saw some things when he was growing up. So I don't think that it was a surprise to her. Instead, the characters in this story who surprised me the most are the servants. The servants, they really impressed me because you have to remember that they were there to do a job and they had no way to control the outcome of that. But imagine when Jesus told them to go serve some to the master of ceremonies, when all they knew they had was a jug of water. Why? Because they poured the water themselves. They knew they didn't have nothing but water. And he was expecting wine. But they didn't panic. Instead, they followed his directions. They followed what he said. Jesus said, serve them the water. They had no way of knowing that that water would turn into wine before it touched the master's lips. No way of knowing. In fact, they didn't even know that was an option. They didn't even know that that could happen. And yet, they followed his direction. They obeyed what he said. Jesus said, serve, and they served. And I thought to myself, it must have taken all of them to come up with one seed, mustard seed of faith. I mean, they must have gathered all their faith together to come up with one mustard seed of faith, but they did it. They held enough faith between all of them to know that, okay, if his mother says that something's going to happen, then we're not going to panic. We're just going to do what he says. And yet they saw and they believed. But what makes me really impressed is that verse 11 tells us that this miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Who believed first? The servants or the disciples? See, the servants believed even before the disciples believed, because the disciples had to see it to believe it. But the servants took it on faith. They took him at his word. If you say something's going to happen, we're just going to follow. We're just going to obey. That to me is very impressive. And I think about the fact that they were servants, and it could have cost them more than their job to come up empty-handed when they went to serve the master of ceremonies. So much more could have happened to them than just losing their job. Talk about pressure. But sometimes God applies pressure to produce purpose in us. Sometimes the pressure that our life, that is in our life, see, it produces something in us. It produces purpose. When we are pressed on every side and things aren't going our way and we just don't know where to look, the most important thing to remember is that faith is when we decide to look up. Faith happens when you stop looking to everyone else to have a solution to the problem and you start just looking up. That's when faith happens. I'm going to ask you to go with me to another story. It's the book of Daniel, and we're going to be in chapter 3, verses 16 through 28. Talk about pressure. This is a story of 3 young men who have, first of all, they've been taken out of their homes. These 3 young men, when they were young boys, their people came under attack from the Babylonians, and they were taken into exile. They were taken away from their families, from their homes, from their synagogues, from everything that they knew and loved. And they had to change everything about themselves. Even their names had been changed in order to assimilate them to Babylonian culture, because they'd been taken out of their homeland and they'd been taken to a land called Babylon, where they became servants. And as they grew and matured, they grew in their positions as well. They were promoted, because they were good men. And their king at the time, the king of Babylon, was a king called Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar had insisted that it didn't matter who you were or where you came from. If you lived in his kingdom of Babylon, you were going to bow to him and him alone. Now, these 3 young men were called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when they left their home, they didn't leave alone. They left with a 4th friend. His name was Daniel. And that's the book that we're reading. We're in the book of Daniel. Now, we know Daniel from Daniel in the Lion's Den, but we also have to remember that the 3 that were with him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had gone through all of the same things that Daniel went through. They had to keep themselves pure. They had to keep themselves kosher. They had to keep themselves, at least a piece of themselves, who they truly were. Because when they got moved to Babylon, the king tried to change everything about them. Like I said, he even changed their names. He changed their appearance. He tried to change their diet. And they did everything that they could to keep hold of who they were. Because what they were saying was, okay, you can change my hair, you can change my clothes, you can even change my name. But what you can't change about me is my faith. That's the one thing that nobody can take away. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were told that if they refused to bow to a statue that the king had constructed, the king was feeling himself at the time. He was thinking that he was really powerful, and he had had a dream, and Daniel had helped to interpret the dream. But he decided that he was going to make it happen. He constructed a big statue made of gold, and it was 90 cubits, which ended up being like 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. This was a massive statue. This wasn't the size of like a small trinket. This was a massive statue, and it took so much time and so many people and so many resources to construct that the king was like, everybody's got to bow to this. I don't care who you are, where you're from, what your creed is, or who your God is. When I play this certain theme song of mine, every knee has to bow. And he unveiled it, and he had his orchestra play this song. And every single knee in the kingdom, no matter who you were or where you were, every knee had to hit the ground. But here, where we're going to be in Scripture, we're going to find that 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, would not bow. They simply could not bow. Because like I said, they were holding on to the one thing they had left of themselves, which was their faith. See, because they knew the Torah. They had memorized it. They knew the 10 commandments, and they knew that the first commandment was what? Thou shalt have no other God before me. And the second commandment was, thou shalt not make any graven image. So 1 and 2, they would have already been out. They could not bow to that graven image. They could not worship any god other than their true king. So let's go to the story. We're in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. See, Nebuchadnezzar was so angry and enraged that someone would dare to not bow to his statue, that he had made a decree that if anybody chose not to, that they would immediately be tossed into the fiery furnace. Well, I thought you said they were promoted and they had done really good. Yeah, they were very helpful. They were promoted. They were favored because of their good deeds and because of who they were. They were good men in the kingdom, and they were useful to the king. But the king, he was really, really feeling himself. So he felt like he deserved their praise. And he had made it the law that if you refused, you immediately got tossed into a fiery furnace. But here they were telling them, I'm sorry, your majesty. They weren't disrespecting him. They were simply saying, we can't do that. That's not for us. Look at verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. See, that's how you know God don't like ugly. God don't like ugly. He was so enraged, he said, you know what? Turn it up 7 times higher. But God doesn't like ugly. The soldiers that were throwing them in fell to their death. They were consumed by the flames. Look at verse 23. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Oh, yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. Tell me God doesn't answer in the time of need. See, these 3 young men, they had done everything that they could do to stand on their faith. And they were trying their faith. Nebuchadnezzar was testing their faith from the moment that he called them up, because they were accused. They were accused by Nebuchadnezzar's other servants, by his other guard. They were accused, and these astrologers were telling Nebuchadnezzar they're not bowing, and their fingers were being pointed at them. So from that moment, they had to stand in their faith. From the moment that they were accused, they had to stand in their faith. From the moment that they were brought to Nebuchadnezzar, they had to stand in their faith. From the moment that Nebuchadnezzar ordered their death, they had to stand in their faith. Even as they were being bound and tied, they had to stand in their faith. How many of us sometimes when it's starting to get a little tight, we're like, okay, Lord, I'm standing in my faith, but it's starting to get hot around here. And we expect for God to answer us when we want his answer. It would have been great if God would have released the binds from them and made all the ropes fall from them, and they wouldn't even had to go near the fire. Wouldn't that have been amazing? But that's not what he did. God didn't rescue them when they were pointing at them. God didn't rescue them when Nebuchadnezzar was was commanding their death. God didn't even rescue them when they were being tied, even to the point when the soldiers who were throwing them in were dying because of the fire. That wasn't when God rescued them. See, it's not about our timing and when we want to be rescued. It's not about what we want things to look like and the path that we want things to go. It's about God's will. Because at any other point in that story, if they had been rescued, it could have been pointed to anybody else. They could have said, so-and-so released them, so-and-so maybe made it happen to where they were rescued. At this point, when they were already in the fire, there was no one to rescue them but God. No one else could take the glory for that. No one else could be seen as the one true God. So what happens is they throw them into the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar, watching from a distance, because he saw what happened to his soldiers, he's watching